So I'd like to welcome everyone back. So I'm very excited about our first panel this afternoon and grateful to all of the panelists who have agreed to participate. The idea was to get representatives from the different colleges, arts and letters, science and engineering, to just kind of talk about what it is that the humanities, the effect and the interplay and the dialogue that we can start. Listening to papers, it's fun in many ways, but it's really just the first step in the process. And the panel I see is a second step in hoping to contribute to a dialogue. And also we have Steve Wheatley here from the American Council of Learned Societies, who's going to try to set it in a national, international context. And then Don Howard will be chairing the panel as the director of the Riley Center for Technology, Science, Technology, and Values. And he has a gavel that could stun a bear, but you didn't bring that. But you're going to keep everyone on track. So I'll turn it over to Don.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Jay. I promise to be a gentle chair of this session, unless Peter gets really out of control here. Let me begin just speaking from my point of view as director of the Riley Center, as someone whose entire career has been lived in the field of the history and philosophy of science. This is an interesting perspective because while we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity in the academy today and have for a number of decades, ours is a field, the history and philosophy of science, that has been interdisciplinary from the ground up, from its inception as a somewhat freestanding area of inquiry in the academy well more than a century and a half ago. That interdisciplinarity has taken many forms. One that I prize very, very much is the intimate relationship between the historical and the philosophical scholarship and the technical work of various scientific communities, on the other hand. I can illustrate this in a number of different ways. For example, we can talk about two of the very important founding figures in the history and philosophy of science in the latter part of the 19th century. I'm a great fan of the work of the French physical chemist Pierre Duhem, who began his career as a physical chemist, developed quite a well-earned reputation in the field, but by the 1890s turned his efforts almost entirely in the direction of the history of science and the philosophy of science. On the side of the history of science, he did path-breaking work, especially in areas like the history of medieval and Renaissance cosmology, statics, mechanics, and so forth. His 1906 book in the philosophy of science, The Aim and Structure of Physical Theories, was one of the most impactful books of its day and remains to this very day one of the most frequently read and discussed books in the field. He couldn't have done this work had it not been for his start in physical chemistry. Or another good example of roughly the same period is the physicist Ernst Mach, who early in his career made essential contributions in areas like optics and acoustics. It's thanks to the latter that we now use his last name as the name for the unit by which we measure multiples of the speed of sound, Mach 1, Mach 2. Like Duhem, by the 1880s in his case, really the late 1870s, he had turned most of his attention to the history and philosophy of science. Wrote groundbreaking works on the history of mechanics, later on the history of the kinetic theory. Again, equally path-breaking books in the philosophy of science, especially his book called The Analysis of Sensations, one of the most important documents, broadly speaking, in the history of empiricism in the philosophy of science. Mach is very interesting because he happens also to be the first person who ever occupied an academic chair, specifically designated as a chair in the history and the philosophy of science. This was at the University of Vienna in 1895, a chair that for many reasons became very important later on in the history of at least the philosophy of science. It's not just a matter of personalities, it's also a matter of the way in which the different disciplines talked with one another. One theme that I've written a little bit about over the years that I find especially fascinating is the sort of symbiotic relationship that developed in the latter part of the 19th century between the new field of the philosophy of science and the new field, and it'll surprise you when I say this, the then new field of theoretical physics. theoretical physics as an autonomous area of work within physics was, in fact, something very new in the latter part of the 19th century. Very few chairs in theoretical physics. What was the nature of the symbiosis? Well, in part, it was this. In order for theory to win a place in science, we had to theorize the notion of theory. And a lot of the most important early work in the philosophy of science was of exactly that kind, trying to understand what theory is as a way of knowing autonomous from experimental physics. So the philosophers of science were, in a sense, providing a kind of legitimation for this enterprise of theoretical physics. The favor was repaid, of course, by the theoretical physicists, especially of that revolutionary generation of Einstein and then later Bohr and Schrödinger, Heisenberg and so forth. That generation of theoretical physicists whose careers were in part made possible by the rationalization the philosophers provided. They're then providing the theoretical grist for the philosopher's mill, because philosophy of physics also began to grow up at that time as a very important part of the philosophy of science, more broadly speaking. I find no better evidence on the point of what ought to be the relationship between the technical fields and work in the history and philosophy of science than that is afforded by the individual on whom I've worked most intensively over my career, and that is Albert Einstein. And I'd like to wrap up my brief part of this with just two little short excerpts, one from a letter, one from a paper of Einstein's. And let me start with a letter. This is from December of 1944, from Einstein to a very interesting fellow, about whom I love to talk, by the way, Robert Thornton, who's interesting, among other things, because he's the very first African-American PhD in the philosophy of science, University of Minnesota, 1944, under Herbert Feigl, with a dissertation on the logical structure of scientific theory. He began his career teaching physics at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, in 1944, and he wanted to introduce history and philosophy of science into the physics curriculum. He met resistance from his senior faculty. And what to do, he thought, well, I'll write to the great Einstein and get Einstein's opinion about the worth of putting history and philosophy of science into physics. He got a lovely letter back from Einstein, who wrote the following. I fully agree with you about the significance and educational value of methodology, as well as history and philosophy of science. So many people today, and even professional scientists, seem to me like somebody who has seen thousands of trees but has never seen a forest. A knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from the prejudices of his generation, from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. I just love those words. That makes it appear as if all the benefit flows from the historian and the philosopher to the physicist. But Einstein's view of this was that it was very much a two-way street. And to illustrate that, just bear with me as I read you one last bit. This is from a paper he wrote in 1936 called Physics and Reality, published in the Journal of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, where he wrote the following. He says, how does, oh, excuse me, I'm reading the wrong passage. Here we go. Where he wrote the following. He said, it has often been said, and certainly not without justification, that the man of science is a poor philosopher. Why then should it not be the right thing for the physicist to let the philosopher do the philosophizing? Such might indeed be the right thing at a time when the physicist believes he has at his disposal a rigid system of fundamental concepts and fundamental laws which are so well established that waves of doubt cannot reach them. But it cannot be right at a time when the very foundations of physics itself have become problematic as they are now. At times like the present, when experience forces us to seek a newer and more solid foundation, the physicist cannot simply surrender to the philosopher the critical contemplation of the theoretical foundations. For he himself, the physicist, knows best and feels more surely where the shoe pinches. In looking for a new foundation, he must try to make clear in his own mind just how far the concepts which he uses are justified and our necessities. Anyway, I like this, Einstein's way of thinking about this as a two-way street. And I heartily commend this as a model for our thinking about how the disciplines talk to one another. So, Peter.
So it's, I find it interesting and a little bit ironic that Don would quote those two passages from Einstein. We were just having a conversation about Einstein before the panel began. And what's intriguing to me about Einstein is how committed he was in his public statements to openness and to lack of prejudice and to lack of bias. And yet, even the great man, fell prey on occasion to being exactly that, to being prejudiced and to being biased. And he admitted it. And so at least he was honest about his own feelings later in life. But it was always a great challenge for him to struggle to be open, I think, when he examined the underpinnings of the edifice that he created of modern physics, or he helped to create. So I was asked to make a few comments about the value of the humanities and engineering. And in particular, Jay asked me if I'd make a few comments about ethics in engineering. And this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And many of you may be aware that the National Science Foundation and a lot of other funding agencies have really gotten a bit strident in the last few years about demanding that engineers and scientists and applied scientists put research ethics into their proposals, that we offer training in research ethics. And I find it interesting in my own discipline that very few undergraduate students have any formal training in ethics. So I teach a course in the master's program in engineering, science, and technology entrepreneurship in technology and ethics. And when I ask the class, which is typically 25-30 students at the beginning of each class when I teach the course, how many of you have had any formal training in ethics? Typically I will get 3 or 4 hands go up out of 25 or 30. And so there's a great dearth of any formal training in ethics, and I would argue even informal training in ethics. So what I try to share with the students are sort of the foundational underpinnings of the National Society of Professional Engineers Code of Ethics, which at its very root are things like honesty and integrity, the safety and well-being of persons, objectivity, lack of conflict of interest, just very fundamental humanistic values that you would hope they could connect to their engineering and their technology pursuits. We spend a lot of time on philosophical ethics. What are the undergirding theories or philosophical theories behind ethical frameworks. So we spend time on consequentialism, we spend time on deontology. I spend a fair amount of time on virtue ethics. And then we relate that to some fundamental questions, which I find is really the value of humanities and engineering, is the ability to pose very fundamental questions that are actually at the root of the presuppositions that scientists and engineers have behind their whole ability to do their project. So it's interesting that the university has devolved into such a multiversity that if you ask a lot of scientists and engineers today, well, what are the underlying presuppositions that undergird your ability to do science? A lot of scientists and engineers won't give you a very thoughtful or sophisticated answer. And yet, we believe as scientists and engineers and mathematicians that the world's orderly, that it obeys mathematical laws, that these mathematical laws are discoverable by induction. I mean, there's a whole panoply of underlying presuppositions, and yet a lot of scientists and engineers can't articulate them, they can't defend them. And I think this is a big area where humanities have a lot to say to scientists and engineers. So we spend a lot of time on that. The topic that I find gets the most play in this technology and ethics class I teach is there such a thing as an intrinsically evil act or an intrinsically good act? And I find the class really almost becomes unhinged when I pose that question. And the debate and the conversation and the dialogue is really at a whole different plane. They come out of the class, they say they love it, they want to talk some more about it. I'm sure they go outside the class and debate it endlessly with their classmates. That one really gets a lot of play. We talk a lot about the right to life, among other rights. We talk about the common good, and then we spend a lot of time on a number of case studies at the intersection of technology and ethics. And I think this is an important class for the students because I think it begins to integrate their learning in a way that maybe they haven't yet done up till that point in their education. We also spent about 4 weeks having the students craft an original research paper on an important topic at the intersection of technology and ethics, and we've had all kinds of fascinating topics, everything from the ethics of, is just war even feasible in an age of technology? What are the ethics of autonomous war machines? What's the ethics of euthanasia and assisted suicide? There's a whole panoply of topics that the students zoom in on. A lot of them that get repeated from year to year, but I kind of let them have free reign on what they want to focus on. The last thing I would say is that I think what's very powerful about this course I teach, and I think what's very powerful about this conversation that we're having today, is forcing engineers and applied scientists to what I would call use the whole brain. There's been a lot of talk in educational circles about STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, education, and I think some very thoughtful people around the country have said, well, it's not STEM, it's STEAM. It's because if you don't have the arts and the humanities, and you don't have, you don't really have that whole other dimension of learning, people become one-sided in the use of their brain, and you lose a very important dimension of what I would call holistic thinking, or as Aquinas says, intellectus. We're really good at ratio, but we're maybe not so good at intellectus, and I think, this is really an important dimension, at least in my experience, that the modern research university is at risk of losing. And so I'm grateful to Jay for having this welcoming conference and having this panel. I hope we have some good discussion around these points, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. I mentioned this morning that we have a kind of unusual situation here at Notre Dame where we have deans who are really interested in this project, and I don't know the last time you heard the Dean of Engineering speak like that, but that'll tell you a little bit about what we have going on here, and I think it's just terrific. So thanks to Peter. Initially when this panel was constructed, the title was a little different. So the Humanities and Social Science contribution to science, engineering, and medical. And I noticed the social science disappeared. Maybe the title was just too long or something. Or maybe, Jay heard what, in popular culture is the most important physicist of the day, Dr. Sheldon Cooper, intoned the social sciences are largely hokum, and so decided to drop it. But so I actually came at this thinking about the social science angle a little bit, and I'm not going to say anything brilliant here. You all know this stuff better than I do. In fact, we're kind of preaching to the choir, I think, in a sense here. But I will say, as an administrator, I'll step into my social science hat in a second here. I do recognize that as an administrator, the importance of linking the humanities, the social sciences, science and engineering, and other fields too, law and business and so on. If we continue to operate in these silos, as Don and Peter both kind of mentioned, we may produce good work, but I think it's safe to say we won't produce the best work. And so I think if we're going to be at our best, we need to spend more of our energy linking with each other. Other people are using different approaches to attack the same kinds of problems, and if we don't learn from them, at least we'll slow our collective progress down and and reinvent some wheels that we don't need to. But worse, we might miss something altogether or promulgate bad ideas. So I think that's really important. And really, in my experience as administrator, my most satisfying moments have been from my little perch up here. I can see different things going on where somebody's working on something over here, and then I see someone over there that they have no connection to, and I realize that there's a connection that they could both benefit from, and I'm able to link them up. That's really been the most satisfying moments for me, just watching those sparks fly when you just kind of help those connections develop. So that's been my experience, and something that's sort of made me able to suffer these administrative tasks. So okay, a couple of non-brilliant things, since I don't have anything brilliant, about what the social sciences bring to the table. And I think I could now talk about what the I'm not sure if I should be talking about what the humanities bring to the social sciences, what the social sciences bring to science and engineering. But here's a couple of spots of connection which I think are interesting. There's many, many more, but these are ones that kind of pique my interest. One is, undoubtedly a well-duh kind of notion for this audience, but it's so important to understand the social context under which science operates. How is scientific work encouraged, channeled, blocked, replicated? Take, for example, this very important project I think that's going on in the Riley Center now about the ethics of emerging weapons technology. I mean, it's societal, cultural, political forces that make these weapons and their specific potential uses relevant in the first place. And it's critical to understand that backdrop. Anybody who studies the history of science is well acquainted with the notion that context tracks invention. And you can't, for example, understand the state and position of evolutionary theory without appreciating the social context that conditioned that, and it's continuing to condition the development of that field. So that's one really important issue I think that social science brings, is kind of an appreciation of that social context. A second thing is, somebody mentioned to me that disciplines are always, just yesterday we were having a conversation about this, and someone was saying, well, yeah, they ripped off that idea from X field and so on. And disciplines are always ripping things off from each other. There's nothing wrong with that, I think. One might think there is less science and engineering people ripping things off from the social sciences than the other way around, but I'm not really sure about that. I think what we need is a social scientific study to find out. But even so, there are definitely things that flow the other direction. And there are, for example, statistical techniques that have been developed and refined in the social sciences that have made their way into science and engineering inquiry. I have a little footnote here. I said, don't ask me which ones. I used to know that, but I'm just a befuddled administrator now, and I can't be held responsible for producing footnotes any longer. So, but we have a department here, Applied in Computational Mathematics and Statistics, that's really an interdisciplinary department that reaches across engineering, science, and the social sciences in an organic way, and that's where the best stuff comes from. Right now, I think the burgeoning area of network science is one where there's a really strong, if you can tolerate the word, synergy among social scientists, physicists, and computer science and engineers. Many approaches to networks really gestated in the social science realms and have been brought even more to life through the work of those in the natural and computer sciences. The usefulness of these approaches has been demonstrated using both social network and non-social network data, and much has been learned by combining the knowledge from these different realms. Indeed, again, one of our most organically interdisciplinary centers here at Notre Dame is ICENSA. That's lowercase I, capital C, lowercase e, capital N, S, capital A, ICENSA. It stands for the Interdisciplinary Center for Network Science and Applications. Now, truly, this is one of the most tortured acronyms I've seen in a long time, but the group is really doing some exciting work by combining the approaches from these different fields. It's just an excellent example of what can come out of that kind of connection. Last thing I'll say is about distribution of knowledge. When I was a graduate student, and even now really, the part of the whole enterprise that is most difficult for me is the writing things up. I like the part where you collect the data, you think of the puzzle, you try to figure out the analysis and what the data can tell you about the puzzle you're working on. After that, after I figure it out, I kind of lost interest. It's hard to sit there and regurgitate it and put it into a form that other people can appreciate. It's good enough for me. Why isn't it good enough for them? For me just to say, I found this, it's done. My advisor, God bless her, convinced me that presentation was part of the research process and a critical part. The job was not done until dissemination had occurred. And there's a lot of social science work about how that happens. How do ideas diffuse? How does technology diffuse? Why do some things catch on and spread while others that really are just as good of ideas and just as useful don't? They're blocked somehow. What blocks, filters, and enhances the diffusion of science and technology? Well, those are social kinds of processes, and it's very important to understand them in order to be able to not only track what's happened in science and engineering advance, but to understand what's happening now and how we might facilitate other kinds of growth in those fields. So let's see. So we have to understand those if we are going to adequately complete the critical phase of research, that presentation part. All right, I had a joke about nobody should do surveys but social scientists, but I'll let that go because I ran out of time. If you want to hear the joke, I can give it later.
Well, thanks, Jay, for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. For me, it's kind of interesting. I find myself sort of being a caricature in this, my role in this panel, because originally, when I started out before college, I didn't really even want to go into science. I mean, you're supposed to be into it, yeah, get good grades, that's fine, but I can't say that's what I wanted to do. Some things happened, I ended up going into science, and so now it's funny that I am sort of the example of the artisan or the technical guy that's so deep into his little world that I now have to talk from like the other side, the evil dark side of science that I didn't want to go into. So that's where I'm coming from, just to give you some background on myself. I have a very multidisciplinary track within science. I started out in physics and then went to biophysics and then into physical chemistry and then into pharma for about 10 years. So I did research in pharma. And then I started Notre Dame in 2003 with my own group, still focused on biophysical problems. And just, I'm sure there's a variety of opinions from people sort of in my rank, but my feeling is, and I'm glad to hear it's actually otherwise from what you said, but there's no communication between science and humanities. I mean, to be blunt, for the last 17, 18 years, I've been totally isolated from that, just unless I have my own interest, I read books and so forth, but that aren't technical papers, but there's no communication, and that's bad. I think clearly it's bad. The way I got interested to science, and it wasn't something I had to do, but was actually interesting, was there are three influences I just jotted down here. One was a book by this guy named E.T. Bell, Metamathematics. So the science thing isn't so bad after all. I mean, you start reading through it, and I got interested in physics that way. I was very lucky in undergrad to have two professors physics professors that write well. One is N.D. Merman. He writes about quantum mysteries. So that was very inspirational, that science and humanities don't have to be at war with each other. So the things this is shooting from the hip here, stuff that I think someone in my rank feels that history of science, how that could impact positively how science is being carried out right now. Right? History of science should be able to critique and in principle improve the way that we carry out science right now. So first point is, why is it in science that communicators of science are looked down upon? If you are a good communicator in science, the suspicion is your research is not going well. That's bad. I think it's very bad, and especially right now when the public understanding of science seems to be going downward, not upward. Yet there's so much information available, right? I guess what happens is everybody just kind of drills down into their prejudices based on the internet. But that's not good. I think there should be, people in science should be rewarded for being able to communicate science and not looked as, oh, well, why aren't you working, on getting more publications out? I mean, they're both important, but I think, well, precisely that, they're both important. Another point this history of science could comment on is why is it that funding is based so much on hypothesis-driven research? Now, you have to have hypothesis, you have to have preliminary data, and that's great. Is it true that all the great advances in science have come from incremental hypothesis-driven research, because that's all that's getting funded nowadays? It's very, very, very cautious. So I think history of science could say, well, look, I mean, there's a place for incremental research, but there have been so-called fishing expeditions also, like that will damn your proposal, right? If you say fishing expedition, if you get that as a critique, you're done, right? But I think advances have been made with these kinds of proposals, so that's something history of science could comment on. Why is it that interdisciplinary science is so difficult? I'm glad to hear it's actually not as difficult as I thought, but that the prejudices between chemistry, physics, and biology are truly amusing if you could step outside of it, right? Oh, you're just a biologist, what do you know? You're just a physicist, what do you know? I think it's good we're moving away from that, but I find it from someone who really hates boundary lines between disciplines that must be historical accidents, right? They must be, yet we have difficulty collaborating with one another because of that. The fourth point is history of science that helps avoid or better understand the rediscovery of old results. So a common thing we say in meetings is that, okay, just wait 10 years, everyone will forget that citation, you can rediscover it, you can get your paper out there, you can get your H-index up there or whatever. That's, H indices and impact factors and all this stuff that is kind of a cancer, I feel like, in science. History of science could help us be more intelligent about that. Now, you mentioned networks. It's all networks now. If you can write network in your proposal, this is a good thing. I am part of that, actually. So we're interested in protein-protein interactions and network science, and the subject you mentioned has been very, very useful for us. So, another point is, I think there's this emphasis right now on students graduate school in particular, being an apprenticeship. That science education is like an apprenticeship, and it is. But I think we just heard, and you two said it much better than I am, that there's more to a science education than just saying, okay, how's this going to benefit me? It's heartbreaking to hear graduate students come in with the attitude already, I mean, they're too young for this, right? They go, yeah, but how does that affect me? So if you say you should learn about this, and the answer is, look, I hate to say this, but you don't know what you need at this particular point. Have some intellectual curiosity beyond just what is going to help you do what you need to get the experiment done tomorrow. I mean, that's important, but I think a humanistic education, I mean, you guys have already said it, is part of getting the most out of yourself. Writing. This is something, why is it that right now, at least my experience, it's very seldom, I think, that the graduate students write their own papers and they write them well. So a common whining session I have in meetings is, oh, did you have to write the whole thing too? Is yes, because somehow the writing skills are just atrocious. And when the students try to write something, they ape this sort of, it is easily seen for the most casual observer that, some kind of static that they read, that's something that humanities and science ideally should work together better, because I can't stand scientific writing. It's terrible because it goes against everything I learned in English composition of how to write. It's just a personal preference. So I try to fight the editors when I write my papers. It does not always have to be the passive voice. It's not always easily seen, or it just is. I think that's something that humanities and science can get together. And then the last point, because I'm probably running out of time, is it would be very easy, especially now, to get very cynical about science and engineering research, right? Because you have to get grant proposals, and they're usually rejected, and money's hard to find. And in the end, it seems like you're just leaping from crisis to crisis, right? And public understanding of science seems to be going down. So that could make you a little bit like, yeah, what's the point? So I actually had this conversation with my postdoc. I said, at some point, I said, why are we doing this? And he said, oh, that's a philosophical question. And I said, yes, but if you can't answer that question right away in 5 seconds, kind of what you said, if you can't answer that question in 5 seconds right away, you got a problem. I mean, I mean, every profession, of course, has its little pitfalls, and this is the one of science. But if you can't say why you want to do this stuff in spite of all these human-made problems, then somehow your education is incomplete. And I think humanistic education, and especially the history of science, can improve the process in all these different question areas. So, I'm done.
Well, thank you. And thank all of you, because I really appreciate the invitation to join this conference, which is both serious and celebratory. And Jay and his colleagues planned it very well, because if we conclude this week with a celebration, it opened with a celebration. If you were watching television last Sunday, you saw the beginning of 4 days celebrating the 60th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth II in London. Now, is there anything in common between these two celebrations? Well, Her Majesty herself has given us a clue. The following statement has been ascribed to her, quote, "I need to be seen to be believed." Well, those of us who have looked at her choices in millinery agree. I need to be seen to be believed. But what, of course, she means is that if the monarchy is to have public legitimacy, she can't remain cloistered in the palace, but has to make her role visible and majestic. And so it is with knowledge work, with what we're celebrating here today. As Jeff just said, we're not always good at communicating. I'm afraid humanists are not good at communicating what they do. Universities are, of course, seen, but we too often just naturalize and flatten out what intellectual production is. So it's good to pause today for some celebration of the institutions that help bear new knowledge, to enjoy some modest congratulation, to parade your own majesty, and to steel yourselves for the work ahead. So we're talking now about what we can say to each other, and there's been a lot of talk about the intellectual substance. I'll focus a little more on institutional frameworks, and with a fairly broad brush. I'm going to consider three dialogues, three pairs of conversations: humanities and sciences, ACLS and the history of science in general, and HSS in particular, and learned societies and universities. Okay, first, the humanities and the sciences. Now, mentioning the humanities and the sciences in one phrase, of course, invites contrast. C.P. Snow's analysis of two cultures is evoked reflexively, very often, and seems to suggest an unbreachable chasm. And certainly there is. There is an institutional and organizational divide. Jeff is not talking with any humanists. I don't think that's an uncommon experience that humanists are not talking to scientists. And it's a divide where resources, by which of course I mean money, public regard, and a recognizable life outside the academy are all sitting over there on the side of science. Now, this circumstance sometimes produces resentment among humanists, a sort of science envy, which gives rise to a lot of self-deprecating comparisons, such as when it's observed that the budget of the National Endowment for the Humanities is considered decimal dust when compared with that of the National Science Foundation. But, and I think it's important for us to just settle in here, that this relationship is a historical reality, and we in the humanities should not spend time crying about it. In the modern structures of the organization of knowledge, the humanities are playing catch-up. Historian Lawrence Levy has long observed that for the humanities, quote, theirs is the story not so much of the creation of professions from scratch as a transition from an older, long-existing outlook and mentality to newer and more specialized versions of it. By the time the humanities had reached the definition of academic fields of the modern research universities, the pattern of research support had been set by philanthropic foundations and set on the basis of supporting science. The same is true with government funding, and as was just said, STEM is often driving the discussion of educational policy today. This is just a reality. And science advocates did not and do not, as we hear, seek to perpetuate this divide. As evidence, let me cite one less quoted passage from Vannevar Bush's famous Science, the Endless Frontier. He said, quote, "It would be folly to set up a program under which research in the natural sciences and medicine was expended at the cost of the social sciences, humanities, and other studies so essential to national well-being." Quoting another contemporaneous committee, Bush says, "Science cannot live by and unto itself alone." Peter just made the same point. And this is obviously true. Scientists and humanists have a common goal. They look at complex phenomenon, They ask what it means, and they seek to develop explanations and interpretations of it. Okay, fair enough. But what about the history of science and the humanities? My organization takes as its mission the advancement of humanistic scholarship in all fields. Why do we number the history of science as humanistic scholarship? Well, the question answers itself. Here are the answers to the choir. The humanities are the study of many modes of human creativity and the relentless search for meaning that helps define what it means to be human. Science is one of the greatest achievements of human creativity. George Sarton put it a little differently in 1910. He said, "Isn't that really what history is? The evolution of human greatness as well as its weakness?" At another point he said, "The history of science is the only history with which we can illustrate the progress of mankind." Now those are words and terms that don't appeal to us, and it brings to mind a greeting ACLS received when it met in Washington in 1970, and that greeting was, "Every advance in the humanities is a contribution to the national progress." This was a message from President Richard Nixon. And it seems funny to hear it from Nixon today, but I think what's equally funny and disturbing is many humanists would not like the very idea of the national progress. And I think that's part of the question we're wrestling with our self-presentation. ACLS is probably best known for awarding fellowships to scholar teachers. Nicole Archambault, who will speak on the next panel, is one of our fellows. But another area of our activity is sponsoring the production and publication of scholarly reference works. Two of these exemplify the importance history of science has to the overall knowledge field of humanities. As Marcia Richmond knows well, since 1975, ACLS and Cambridge University have managed the production of the Correspondence of Charles Darwin, a monumental collection of eventually 30 volumes which would contain 15,000 letters exchanged with more than 2,000 correspondents. The work of Darwin and his theory of the origin of species through natural selection is, of course, a landmark in the development of contemporary thought about the natural world, and the developments of Darwin's ideas in their historical context cannot be fully understood without the help of his voluminous correspondence. Along with his published writing, all his letters are the most complete and authoritative source of his thought. Now, sustaining long-term documentary editing projects such as the Darwin Correspondence is a great challenge. This effort was originally projected to take 55 years and conclude in the year 2030. And it's difficult to maintain funding and an expert staff capable of applying the deep scholarship on which these projects depend. I'm pleased to say that ACLS and Cambridge have succeeded in raising a wasting endowment, which will make it possible to complete this project 5 years earlier because the editors will be undistracted by writing grants and raising funds. As the late Fred Burkhardt, our president emeritus and the founder of the project, said, "Darwin never disappoints," and in this case he certainly hasn't. Another of our published reference work is the Dictionary of Scientific Biography. Its 1970 preface notes that it's published under the auspices of ACLS and with the endorsement of the History of Science Society, and it was underwritten by the National Science Foundation. But it was made possible, as the editors of the DSP noted, by the large participation of professional historians of science throughout the world, and on the contributions of many professional scientists who, in consequence of their commitment to science itself, take a lively and scholarly interest in the past. Now, turning to HSS, the History of Science Society is one of our 71 member societies. Now, of course, all our children are well above average, but HSS brings distinctive strengths and perspectives to our conclaves. The field it represents is disciplinary in one sense. There are departments, and yet interdisciplinary. It has an institutional base in particular departments and centers, but historians of science are found in many areas. This makes for very interesting discussions and perspectives. And HSS is an important and vital site for carrying out the dialogue between science and the humanities. And if I too, as Don did earlier, may embarrass him, I must note another special asset is Jay Malone, always gracious, friendly, and jovial, but also a hard-headed administrator and a trenchant analyst. Learned societies face enormous challenges in the coming decades, and we're going to need more Jays and more of Jay's help if they are to face those challenges. So let me conclude with a few remarks about the union we celebrate today, the collaboration of scholarly associations on the one hand and research universities. The modern American learned society and the modern U.S. university emerged together in the late 19th century as partners in the idea of the research scholar and in the very idea of research. The learned societies in the latter years of the 19th and early years of the 20th century provided the nervous system for a new and more muscular body of higher education that was taking shape. Associations set standards for research, organized job markets, stimulated scholarly communication, and brought cohesion and collective purpose to a system that had lots of institutional sprawl. Now, learned societies share three defining qualities, which are quite interesting to think about. One, they are essentially voluntary. Other than a small paid staff, the work of all the people you've heard today is voluntary, is done on a pro bono basis. No one is required to join a learned society. But they have open membership and democratic governance. And this is, I think, particularly fascinating from a social scientific point of view, maybe worthy of research, that they have open membership, democratic governance, and they're committed to essentially elitist goals, selecting and recognizing excellence, saying that some articles get in, some articles get out, some things get prizes, some things don't. It's really remarkable how effective they've been over these many years. Now, just as societies and universities were united in the construction of modern higher education, they are now confronted with the need for significant reconstruction and reform of higher education. Today, humanities and especially graduate education and universities are wrought by financial panic. I have a quote from the famous book from 1968 called The Academic Revolution by sociologists Christopher Jenks and David Reisman, and it just shows us how far we've come, so bear with me. Today's graduate economic departments resent even being asked about whether they produce significant benefits to society beyond the edification of their own members, and mark down the questioner as anti-intellectual. To suggest that the advancement of a particular academic discipline is not synonymous with the advancement of the human condition is regarded as myopic. Perhaps, considering the affluence of American taxpayers and the relatively ample supply of talented, well-educated college students, it really is. Ah yes, the affluent American taxpayer prepared to support higher education, to advance graduate education, no questions asked. These two professors must have glimpsed this fabled actor in one of his final appearances on the political stage. We're in a much different age now, and let me suggest very quickly 4 challenges that face that universities and learned societies must engage together: succession, digitization, internationalization, and publication. Succession. Especially in the humanities, we have a problem about how to assure that the pipeline producing successive generations of PhDs will work effectively. We need to look into right-sizing the size and the length of graduate education. We need to reconfigure it so that the classroom is no longer seen as the only place where the knowledge, analytical, and expressive capacities of young scholars can be put to use. And history of science, precisely because it's in dialogue with fields that have life outside the academy, is in especially good position to help with this. Second, digitization. It has an enormous potential for expanding the reach and audience of scholarly research, but it is disruptive of traditional practices of peer review that look to screen out unreliable work. The challenge now is how to harvest the good work, the excellent work, from a much broader and more varied base of scholarly production that includes blogs, that includes lots of digital ephemera, and to assure its long-term preservation and curation. This problem can't be solved without the cooperation of learned societies and university librarians, and I know that Notre Dame librarian Diane Parker Walker is a leader in taking on many of these questions. Internationalization. We live in a fundamentally interdependent global economy, and we also have an internationally independent global economy. Transborder flows of students, faculties, researchers, and knowledge are essential to the vitality of every field, and promoting genuine equilateral cooperation can be tricky, but learned societies, and here again HSS is a leader, because they have a tradition of voluntary and collegial engagement are an important force. And finally, publication. And I don't mean book and article production, but engaging the public continually and most broadly. What Queen Elizabeth says of herself is true of the research enterprise. We must be seen to be believed. We need to engage if we are to have public legitimacy and support. And HSS, the Riley Center, and Notre Dame are working together, and I hope they have many fruitful years of working together in that partnership. So I'll stop there.